I want to begin with a very simple question. Why does this have value? Not in a legal sense, not because it has a portrait on it, not because people are used to seeing it. I mean, why does this thing actually hold purchasing power at all? At the end of the day, it is paper, cotton, and linen. That is all. If you took away the system built around it, it would not feed you, house you, fuel a factory, or keep a nation warm. Its value comes from demand, real demand, forced demand, structural demand. That is the first thing people need to understand if they want to understand de-dollarization. The dollar is not powerful because it is morally superior or naturally scarce. It is powerful because the world has been organized in a way that creates enormous demand for it. Inside the United States, you need dollars to pay taxes, pay your mortgage, service your debts, pay your rent, buy food, stay out of legal trouble, and function inside the economic system. Outside the United States, the demand was made even stronger because global trade, energy settlement, reserve management, and treasury markets were all built around the dollar. That is what gave the dollar its strength. And if that demand begins to weaken, then the value of the dollar weakens with it. That is the whole subject we are dealing with here. De-dollarization is not a slogan. It is the gradual reduction in global demand for dollars. It is not one event, it is a process. And the reason I care about it is very simple. If global demand for dollars falls, then more dollars are chasing the same goods, the same energy, the same imports, the same services, the same lifestyle. That means more inflation pressure, higher interest rates, weaker purchasing power, and over time a lower standard of living for ordinary Americans who never even knew the privilege existed in the first place. That is why this matters. Most people take the strength of the dollar for granted because it has been the backdrop of their whole lives. They assume the world must want dollars, must want treasuries, must want to save in our paper, must want to settle trade in our currency. That assumption is getting weaker, and it is getting weaker in plain sight. The source points to one fact that I think is especially important. Gold has now overtaken U.S. Treasuries as the world's largest central bank reserve asset for the first time in decades. Think about what that means. The institutions closest to the monetary system, the institutions with the biggest pools of reserve capital, are shifting demand away from dollar assets and into gold. That is not random. That is a signal. When central banks choose to hold less in treasuries and more in gold, they are telling you something very clear. They trust the old system less than they used to. Now, why would they trust it less? The source gives 3 reasons, and I think they are the right 3. The first is the weaponization of the dollar. This is one of the biggest turning points in the whole story, and I do not think enough Americans understand it. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies froze a large portion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. In plain English, assets Russia thought it owned and controlled inside the Western dollar system were suddenly made inaccessible. Now, from Washington's point of view, that was policy pressure from the rest of the world's point of view. It was a warning. The warning was simple. If your wealth is held in dollars, then your wealth can be frozen with a keystroke. If you ever become inconvenient enough to the system, that changes how countries think. It changes how central banks think. It changes how any serious actor thinks about reserve exposure. Because suddenly the dollar is not just a store of value or settlement currency, it is also a political risk. And once that happens, every country with enough memory and enough self-interest begins asking the same question: how much of our national savings do we really want held inside a structure that can be used against us? That question is the beginning of de-dollarization. The second reason is even simpler: fiscal irresponsibility. The United States government brings in about $5 trillion in tax revenue and spends around $7. That means it overspends by roughly $2 trillion a year. This is not a one-time emergency anymore. It is structural. We are not dealing with a temporary wartime surge that disappears when the war ends. We are dealing with a governing model that spends far beyond what it honestly collects and finances the gap by selling more debt. That debt pile is now approaching levels no serious person can look at comfortably. When debt is pushing toward $40 trillion and the annual overspend is still massive, the question becomes unavoidable. How exactly does this ever get repaid in money of equal purchasing power? The answer, of course, is that it does not. Not honestly. It gets rolled, it gets inflated away, it gets serviced with weaker dollars. And the more obvious that becomes, the less attractive it is for the rest of the world to keep funneling its savings into the same machine. This is where treasuries matter so much. When foreign governments and central banks hold treasuries, they are effectively lending money to the United States government. They are helping finance our deficits. They are helping keep our borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be. They are helping sustain the system. So if foreign demand for treasuries weakens, the whole system becomes more fragile. Yields rise, borrowing gets more expensive, debt service gets heavier, the spiral tightens. That is why I say de-dollarization is not some abstract geopolitical hobby. It is a rate story, it is an inflation story, it is a standard of living story. Now, the third reason is the Federal Reserve itself. When the government spends 7 and collects 5, there must be buyers for the debt. If there are not enough natural buyers, then the system starts leaning harder on central bank support, direct or indirect, and on wider money creation across the financial structure. You can dress that up in technical language if you want. Call it liquidity support. Call it accommodation. Call it whatever respectable phrase makes the policy class feel civilized. But the practical effect is the same: more dollars, more dilution. And foreign reserve managers can see that just as clearly as anyone else. They know they may be paid back. They also know they may be paid back in money worth less than the money they lent. That is not a subtle distinction. Now let us talk about trade, because that is the bloodstream of this whole issue. For decades, the dollar held its position, not just because America was powerful, but because global trade was arranged around it, energy was priced in it, commodities were priced in it, settlements were made in it, countries accumulated dollars, then recycled those dollars into treasuries and dollar assets. That created a feedback loop. Trade created demand for dollars, dollar demand created demand for treasuries. Treasury demand supported the value of the system. The source says that loop is weakening. I think that is correct. Not disappearing overnight, weakening. Countries are increasingly experimenting with bilateral trade outside the dollar. They are using local currencies, they are building alternative payment channels, they are diversifying their reserve holdings. None of that alone replaces the dollar tomorrow morning, but it does not need to. A dollarization is not a dramatic switch. It is erosion. That is the right word, erosion. And one of the best examples in the source is Russia. The United States attempted to isolate Russia, pressure its economy, and crush it financially through sanctions and reserve restrictions. Those actions did hurt, but they also taught other countries how necessary it is to build trade paths outside the dollar system if they want strategic independence. Russia adapted, trade shifted, settlement shifted, payment structures shifted. What was intended as a show of dollar power also became a lesson in why. Too much dependence on the dollar is dangerous. That is what people mean when they say the policy backfired at the structural level. Now look at Iran. This is where the source becomes especially sharp because it ties de-dollarization directly to oil settlement. Iran is selling most of its oil to China. That oil is not being settled in dollars. It is being settled in yuan. And once Iran receives yuan, what does it do? It buys Chinese goods, machinery, equipment, vehicles, electronics, industrial inputs. In other words, the oil trade never enters the dollar loop at all. That matters enormously. Because under the old petrodollar style logic, oil sold in dollars would generate dollar demand, and those dollars would often be recycled into US assets or US-linked economic activity. But in the system the source is describing, the oil goes east, the payment stays outside dollars, and the recycling goes into Chinese goods and Chinese relationships instead of US treasuries. That is a completely different monetary pipeline, and it explains why Washington dislikes it so much. This is not only about foreign policy. It is about losing the monetary privilege that came from being the center of energy settlement. The source even notes that tolls and settlement related to the regional energy flow are now being quoted in yuan rather than dollars. Again, maybe that looks small in isolation. It is not small if the direction continues. Energy is one of the largest markets in the world. Small shifts at that level become large shifts in dollar demand over time. And that brings us to what I think is the best indicator of de-dollarization progress. The treasury market. If countries trade in dollars, they accumulate dollars. If they accumulate dollars, they need a place to store them. Treasuries have historically been one of the main places. So if fewer countries are transacting in dollars, then fewer surplus dollars need to flow into treasuries. That means weaker treasury demand. And once treasury demand weakens, yields rise. The source gives a very simple analogy for this, and I think it works well. If a famous and trusted borrower needs money, many people line up to lend to him, and they are willing to do so at lower rates because demand is high. If an unknown borrower with uncertain prospects needs money, lenders demand a higher rate because demand is low and risk is higher. The United States has long benefited from being treated like the famous borrower. Dollarization chips away at that privilege. Less demand means higher yields are required to attract lenders. That is terrible news for a government carrying this much debt. And it is also terrible news for ordinary Americans, because the 10-year Treasury yield and the broader Treasury complex influence almost every major borrowing cost in the country. Mortgages, auto loans, credit, student loans, business financing, everything becomes more expensive when the Treasury market requires a higher rate to attract capital. So when people ask me why they should care about de-dollarization, that is the answer. You should care because it shows up in your life, in your cost of living, in your borrowing cost, in your savings, in your wage pressure, in the purchasing power of the dollars you work for. Now let me make something very clear. The dollar is still dominant. The majority of trade still touches it. Most commodities are still priced in it. I am not saying the dollar is disappearing next month. I am saying the privilege is eroding, and erosion is enough to matter. If demand for dollars gets even modestly weaker over time, the consequences are still enormous because the system was built on the assumption that the demand would remain structurally strong. That is why I think Americans should stop asking whether the dollar is about to vanish and start asking the more intelligent question. What happens if it is simply less wanted than before? That is the real issue. Now, if that is the issue, how do you protect yourself? The source answers that directly, and I think the answer is reasonable. Gold, not because gold is exciting, not because it pays a yield, not because it solves every problem in the world, but because that is where reserve demand is already moving. That is the point. You do not fight a flow like that by pretending it is beneath you. If central banks are replacing treasuries with gold, then gold is no longer some fringe paranoia asset. It is acting like monetary insurance again, and it has one advantage every paper solution lacks. They cannot print it. That matters more than people think. You can own it physically, you can own liquid market vehicles that track it, you can own miners, royalty companies, and streaming companies if you want more leverage to the theme and are willing to accept the extra business risk that comes with that. Different structures suit different people, but the principle stays the same. If dollarization means less demand for dollars and more demand for hard reserve assets, then gold belongs in the conversation. Now, I am not telling anyone to become fanatical about it. I do not believe in turning one asset into a religion. What I do believe is that if the world is slowly moving away from the dollar margin by margin, reserve by reserve, trade lane by trade lane, then the most foolish thing an American can do is sit there assuming none of it will ever touch him. That is the whole point. So let me bring this down to the simplest version. The dollar has value because the world has been structured to need it. Taxes create domestic demand. Global trade and energy settlement created international demand. Treasuries absorbed the recycled demand. That was the loop. Dollarization weakens the loop. Other countries want less exposure to a currency that can be weaponized. They want less exposure to a government that overspends structurally. They want less exposure to a system that prints more when the arithmetic fails. So they diversify, they trade more outside the dollar, they hold fewer treasuries, they hold more gold. That is not a theory. That is the process already underway. And if that process continues, then Americans will discover something painful. A strong dollar was not just a patriotic symbol. It was a subsidy to their standard of living. If that subsidy weakens, the lifestyle built on it weakens too. That is why I would rather prepare than argue. Because by the time the average person realizes what is happening, the purchasing power has already gone.